Hello, this is book review. Narrative of Frederick Douglass. I listened to this book like last week over the course of a couple days. It's a really easy read. It's only 10 chapters. I can't remember how many pages. I'll include the details of the book. Copy and paste from my Kindle ebook page on my website. Yeah, it's a really interesting book because it's actually a story of a life story of a former slave, talking about what it was like being a slave by Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass was a black man. He was a slave who was born, he died at the age of 77 in like 1877. So he lived from like 1800 or something to 1877, something like that. And he escaped slavery when he was like 25 or something like that, after attempting to escape 3 times, and the 3rd time he didn't really give the details of how he escaped because there was some certain underground railroad thing, and he didn't want to get the people in trouble who helped him, and didn't want to let all the slave owners know their methods so that they could put a stop to it. But yeah, he was just people helping people, and he managed to get from wherever he was in Maryland. I mean, and that wasn't so far from the north. Washington, D.C. is in Maryland. All the way up to New York in less than a day by taking different boats and stuff. And then he was free, and he said when he was free, when he gained his freedom, it was like he was alive for the first time. Like he was one day of life there was better than his whole life as a slave. And so, yeah, he was talking about what it was like in the psychology of slavery, and it was really interesting because he was really smart. When you listen to the book, you can tell that it's a really intelligent person, and he's just giving his honest opinion and lots of insights from different angles, and he's not like, it's not motivated by anger, and he's not like exaggerating anything and embellishing stuff out of anger. It's just a person, and he doesn't use like, I guess, dialect or words of black person. I mean, you can't tell like a black person or any certain kind of person is writing the book, and it's timeless too. Just the way the thought forms and everything. It's an amazing book, and in fact, it was so good that people thought that he didn't write it, because they was like, how could a black person write it? But he actually wasn't 100% black. He said that word around town was that his real father was his owner, who was a white guy, and his mother was white. But see, and then he explained how slavery was, and they really did dehumanize people. And in fact, it gave me the idea. It was kind of like getting into the mind of an animal, what it's like, what animals think about. Because not to say that black people are like animals. I think black people and white people are the same. It's just the color of skin that's different. But since they treated black people like animals, and like how it's kind of like how he was explaining, like slaves would respect some slave owners and wouldn't respect others, and wouldn't always do what you say, and it's kind of, that's how kind of animals are. Like if you piss a dog off, he won't come to you, or if you're mean to it, or if you don't follow through with your threats of a dog, they won't follow you. And so he was saying interesting stuff like, the good slave owners would just, like slave owners he liked were the ones who were just, or the ones who were effective were the ones who followed through with their threats. And he gave one, and then the ones who were really angry and tried to be, make you do stuff, sometimes they couldn't get the slaves to do them. And he gave one story. There was some slave who didn't want to be whipped, and they used to whip them all the time. Like that was a way that they would keep the slaves in line. They would just whip them. And a big philosophy of the slave owners was that you would whip the slaves all the time, whether they were good or bad. You just whipped them because it would remind them that they're slaves. And like one time he got whipped so bad, I think because he was passed off from owner to owner throughout his life, and he had one owner who he let the donkey get away. He was supposed to tend the donkeys, and if he like accidentally left the gate open, the donkey would run 5 miles to the other owner. And he would deliberately do that because his owner wouldn't feed him, and some of the owners wouldn't feed their slaves enough, and to the point where the slaves didn't even know what being full even felt like. They were always hungry. And so he had one owner who kept him hungry all the time, but he knew that his brother down the way, when he went down to pick up the donkey, would actually feed him, so he would let the donkey get away so that he would actually know he'd have a full meal. And then he'd come home and get whipped, but it was worth it because he got a full meal. And he got whipped so bad once that he had scar ridges on his back as big as his little finger. And yeah, and he had a story. There was one slave who he was getting whipped, and he jumped in the river up to his neck because he didn't want to get whipped anymore. And the slave owner said, "Get out." And then he held a gun to his head and said, "Get out. By the count of 3, I'll shoot you." And he counted 3, and the guy didn't get out, so he shot him in the head and killed him. And like nobody did anything. Like there was, I guess it was frowned upon to do that, but they could get away with it and get away with what they wanted because, the philosophy was, you have to set an example for the other slaves. But like sometimes some slaves would like certain masters. For example, he had a master called Ald, Mr. Ald, who was his final master before he escaped, and he didn't like Ald at all. In the beginning, Ald's wife was really nice to him, but then as time went on, from being a slave owner, she turned into a really cruel person, and it was part of what he was explaining in the book is that slavery is really bad, obviously for the slave, but it's also really bad for the slave owner because it would turn the slave holder into a really cruel, vicious, angry person. Because I guess, like Ald, the man, taught the women to not let the slaves read books. He was caught, Frederick Douglass was caught reading a newspaper once, and she snatched it out of his hand and said, "You don't watch this," and like whipped him or something for it. And because they said, because like the people would talk in front of the slaves like they weren't there all the time, so the man said to the woman, "Don't let the slaves read, because then it's like," or they would actually explain it to the slaves, being literate and being a slave are incompatible, which is true. Just like being a democracy and being literate for everybody is incompatible. The only way you can have an absolute monarchy is if everybody's illiterate, and the only person who knows what's going on is the king. And same thing with slavery. If the slaves read and can be humans, then they can form opinions and want to get their slavery, get their freedom, and have a rebellion and all that kind of stuff, and wouldn't want to just say yes, massa, and do whatever. But yeah, he said that they would just be really cruel to them. They would work them all day long, like 13 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's kind of how, in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they would treat the laborers. They'd have little 6-year-old kids working in mines. They'd have to get up at like 5 in the morning and work until sunset. And so all they knew was work out their ass off until they like worked to death. And so that's what they did to him. They'd work him. They'd work the slaves out in the cotton fields, no matter what the weather was like. And they just didn't care. They were like weren't even human. And he said that the slave owners who were the most religious were the most cruel. This guy Ald was very religious, and he was always quoting the Bible, certain passages that he used to support slavery. And so Ald would have he would have religious gatherings over at his house and bring other different pastors over. And one pastor was really nice to them, and so all the slaves liked him. And I think he was even instrumental in in setting a bunch of slaves free, and so the slaves knew about that, and so they were nice to him for that. And the slaves band together, and like his best friends were fellow slaves, yeah. But a lot of the book is just explaining the psychology, like the slave owners who they couldn't always get the slave to do what they wanted to. Sometimes slave would refuse, and then they get whipped some more. But like if you whip them too much, then sometimes they just don't care if they live or die. They're so miserable, and so that's when you have to set an example of one of them. And But he said it with such eloquence that it kind of made me, as I was reading the book, feel for the slave owner as well. And I think that's an important thing to do when you think about slavery, because, you know, a lot of white people in the past used to think that black people were genetically not meant to rule themselves, and they would use that as an excuse. And you know, and then so black, and of course that's seen as being racist now, and it's bad to say, but now a lot of angry black people would say that, you know, white people are genetically engineered, genetically programmed to be evil and be killing. That's just as bad on the opposite way. So it's best to just see, I think, both sides of the equation. Yeah, but I mean, that was kind of one of the excuses of why they had slavery is, well, they can't take care of themselves. And I guess it was a little bit easier when they pointed at Africa with the primitive tribes, but they were like, yeah, they can't take care of themselves, so we have to take care of them, but we'll take good care of them. But the fact of the matter is that they don't take good care of them. That's the problem. When you have that much, it's kind of like that saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The slave owners, you know, would invariably just lose all sense of compassion for the slaves, and then just become really nasty, mean, cruel people, and it was just, and in the end, I think miserable people, and so it's not good for anybody. And it's kind of, it reminded me of what these, you know, like ultra right-wing capitalists and their cronies for Fox News are like, oh, but if you let the rich get really rich, then they can hire people. And that's good for the economy. Like trickle-down economics, Reagan. You know? If you let people get rich, then they'll have the money to create more jobs. It's good for the economy. You know, we'll be the benevolent dictator. Don't worry about it. It doesn't work that way. They're not the benevolent dictator. They lose heart. And then they just look at, you know, people who make, somebody who makes $1 million a year, and only works 4 days a week, you know, looks at one of their minions who makes $20,000 a year and is just like, you know, you work 6 days a week because I say so, and they get like bloodthirsty, and it kind of possesses you and takes you over. And the best way to have a system is more where you know, you have to check the balance of power and not let the people have too much power, or they'll go crazy. But you know, there were always good people, good white people who would try to help the slaves go free. When Frederick Douglass, this book, Narrative of Frederick Douglass, was just his life as a slave, and then when he, and pretty much ended not so long after he became free. And I think it was written not so long after he became free. I think it was written when he was only like 29. And then he wrote a bunch of books after that talking about his life, because he did have a really interesting life after that. He lived to be 77. He had a wife of 40 years who he actually was his, it's kind of like Django. He had a girlfriend when he was a slave, and when he gained his freedom, I guess she got free through the same system, and they married, and they were married for 40 years, and then she died. And he lived 11 years after that, but he married a white woman. And one white women suffragist and abolitionist supported their marriage, but most people frowned upon it, because in those days it was really ahead of their time. An old white man or black man marrying a white woman 20 years younger than him, but even though her parents were abolitionists, but he was actually, you know, half white. And when you look at him, he's a really like striking man. He was very intelligent looking, but he kind of had the bone structure of a white man. And when you look at, because he didn't have the thick nose, and when you look at they had a drawing of him, you know, from the posters when he'd give speeches, and if you take the color away, it was a white man. It looked like a white man to me, but his skin was jet black, and he had the afro and everything. But yeah, I mean, he was considered a black person. It's interesting, if you have some black in you, you're considered black. Kind of like Damian Marley, you know, the Rasta man who sings the song, Bob Marley's son, who's got the dreads all the way down to his feet and sings the song, "Welcome to Jamtown, where people are dead at random. Well, if you look at him, most people in America would be, oh yeah, that's a black guy, but he's actually 75% white. His mom was white, and Bob Marley was half white. So it's very racist. But yeah, I mean, the book really does illustrate very well, like, just how dehumanizing slavery is, and actually what a very real detrimental effect slavery had on black people. It actually did turn them into animals and take their humanity away from them, and make it, you know, and thus make it very easy for white people to say, see, look, they're not smart as us, because they weren't, because they had their intelligence sucked away from them. Because and there's an example of how it could happen to anybody. In the preface somebody wrote, somebody captured some white guy and they made him a slave, and they, you know, didn't let him, you know, talk or anything for 3 years, and when they freed him, he couldn't even speak English anymore, you know. And so Frederick Douglass is saying, yeah, like, when you're a slave and you're raised as a slave, because he was born and raised as a slave, his mother was separated from him when he was 1, and they used to do that all the time, separate the families from each other, and they did that when they got him off the boats, just to take all of their, you know, the chances of having a rebellion away from them, and dehumanize them. And but I guess he remembered, you know, his mother would sleep with him at night, and that would be the only time, you know, and then she'd leave before dawn, and then they took her away from him. And but yeah, he said that slaves were, like, kept in so much ignorance that they didn't know anything. Like you know, for a long time he didn't know there were free slaves or free blacks. He didn't even know there was such thing as the North, where there you know, where there was industrialization. Didn't know the name, didn't know anything. All he knew was that, oh, I'm a slave, and there's the edge of the trees. I've been to the edge of the trees once, and they don't know anything. And so, you know, so when they talk, they're given so little information that when they talk, you know, they have a very limited vocabulary, and they can be like, see, look, stupid black people, but, you know, they're not given a chance. He was eventually taught how to read and write through the help of white boys, you know, like nice white boys in the neighborhood, and he'd go study with them here and there and sneak out, and then he'd get busted and they'd whip him for studying. But like he said, whenever a black person, you know, learned to write their name or anything, they were just elated. It was the most exciting thing ever, and they all wanted to learn, and, you know, so they're humans, you know, and it's just a horrible institution that they had going, and, you know, the whole South was just evil and corrupt, and I guess it dehumanized all the slaves, but also dehumanized the whites, and the whites were nuts. And you know they have that, like, story of when the Southerners were fighting in the Civil War, they'd do their scream and fight, maybe because they're all a bunch of batshit crazy lunatics, and they're just like, you're taking our slaves, we're gonna kill you. And it was like a suicide war, and they kept fighting anyway, and by the end the South was just burnt to cinder. There was no infrastructure left, and they had to kind of I think they killed like a quarter of all the white people, or a third of all the white people of age were dead, and yeah, but they had to purge it. But it's interesting how they fought tooth and nail to keep it, because their whole economy was based off it. But that was a fascinating book, and there have actually been a lot of, if you look at the Wikipedia, you know, they have a list. If you look at Narrative Frederick Douglass, they have a list of all the different narratives of ex-slaves, and I think that's the only one that I have on my collection. I don't really know, on the Kindle collection, and the free book should be free.com collection. But that'd be interesting to read some of those other narratives and stories of, you know, like, he had lots of stories. Like, one was, there was a woman who she had been worked all day the day before, and like in the fields, and wasn't allowed to sleep, and then was just pulled in the house to watch a baby. And she was trying to watch the baby, but she couldn't stay awake anymore, so she passed out, and the baby like fell and hit its head or something, and they blamed it on her because she was asleep, so they whipped her to death, and she was only like 16. So, and nobody did anything. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of stories like that, and it's just, But I think when you read it, it's good to, and he's so eloquent that it's good to kind of, I think it's good, you know, because you don't want to get angry and say, oh, black white people are bad. It's good to look at it like, you know, if a soul is born in a black body, you're going to be like a slave. You're not going to know how to talk, you're not going to know anything, and you're going to be dumb. If a soul is born in a white body, you're a slave owner, you're going to be an evil, inhumane person who doesn't care about other life. And so they both suffer, and, you know, there's cause and effect. And underneath it all, it's, you know, the only difference is the color of skin, and we're all human. And we should just remember that. And the lesson I think we should take away from that is we should not let the rich get too rich, because it's kind of like, you know, when you have people who all work all day long and just to make ends meet, and then you have these other class of people who make so much money that everybody in their extended family doesn't have to work, and their family for the whole life and get to do whatever they want. Then, you know, it's bad for the people who have to work all day long, because they won't be able to have time to learn anything, and they'll get bitter. But it's equally as bad for the rich people, because they won't be happy, they won't be fulfilled, and they'll become very bitter themselves at the world, because something's wrong, but they don't know what it is, because they're not doing anything. And you know, people need to, you know, if you go into space, you know, and you don't have to exercise, your muscles will atrophy. And so if you don't have to do anything in your life, you're just going to get dumb, and everybody suffers. So we should bring it all level, and you know, not let the rich get too rich, and to make it so that people can you know, only have to work 8 days a week, or 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and that's enough, you know, and then you can support your family that way, and you know, it's better for everybody. And you really get to see that in third world countries, like in Latin America. The wage discrepancy is like 60 times, you know, within a company, you know, and rich people there are unhappy. They have to lock up their whole houses. They don't get to go in the mountains because it's all private property from other rich people, and you know, people are getting mugged and kidnapped and all that shit. It's not good for anybody. So yeah, any form of slavery is bad, whether it's legalized slavery in America, which was the worst. I mean, that was worse than in America too. And it was weird, because Frederick Douglass was saying people were you know, leaning on the Bible and using the Bible as reasons for it, but he said you know, the Constitution actually says that slavery is I mean, you know, we're all created equal. It's in the Declaration of Independence, but so it's against the Constitution. The slavery is legal, but it was just how our system was, and so they got rid of it. I think Thomas Jefferson was against slavery, though. He actually said the same thing that Douglass said, and that is that, you know, slavery is bad for the poor and the rich. But when everybody's, you know, around you thrives on it, it's kind of hard to get out of that system. But there were a lot of people who helped. But yeah, he had a good life after that. He was nominated as vice president to a woman who ran for president in like the 1870s or something, against his knowledge or approval. But I think he was like a congressman or something for 4 terms. He made a lot of money. He went to England and Germany for a couple years, and he toured all over the world lecturing. He was a lecturer talking about his life as a slave. He made a lot of money. He lived in a big house and then moved to another big house and owned a bunch of acreage, and now it turned into, I think it's in Washington, D.C., on top of a hill, turned into the Frederick Douglass like historical monument or something. Yeah, his son fought in the Civil War and I think died. But yeah, that's a definite good book. One of the best books I've ever listened to. I might want to listen to it again. Yeah, one interesting thing in the book, I'll leave it with this, is his master, Auld, who he didn't like. He had this other slave master who was known as a slave breaker. You know, like all the slaves followed him because he was so strict. Well, he did something that pissed him off, and they were going to tie him to a tree, and he knew that they were going to whip him to death because he'd seen so many slaves get whipped to death, so he fought back. And he fought back, and they couldn't restrain him after like an hour and a half. And anyway, they didn't beat him after that. They respected him. So it's kind of like, it's just weird balance of power psychologically, you know, between slave owners and slaves. Like, sometimes they're like, ooh, the force is strong in that one, leave him alone. And then sometimes they'd shoot him, and sometimes meek ones would just let him walk all over you. And so, you know, but he was one of the strong ones, and they let him live. And he eventually reconciled with his owner, you know, because he was still legally a slave, even though he went to the north. And so he was afraid he was going to get like a bounty hunter captured. So that's why he did the tour in Europe for a couple of years, because they couldn't capture him. And he went back to America. He came through Canada because he didn't want to get intercepted. And some society formed together and actually bought him from his owner for like $750, so that he wouldn't have to live in fear of being captured and made a slave again. And when his master, Ald, the one he didn't like, was on his deathbed, he actually visited him and reconciled with him. And through the invitation of his daughter, of the slave master's daughter, Ald. And he told his daughter, you know, that was a good thing you did to bring him over. And so, yeah, but Frederick Douglass worked hand in hand with the women's suffrage movement, obviously. But I guess there was a little bit of strife there, because when he supported some bill that gave the vote to the blacks before the women, and the women didn't like that, but the black men before the women. But you know, I guess it was just you know, politics. You got to get what you can, got to go for what you can get. But anyways, I recommend the book. Peace out.